You did not arrive here because something was missing. You arrived because something settled. The moment you noticed the quiet underneath your thoughts, the system you were moving through adjusted without asking for your permission, not as an event, as a recognition. This is the point where effort stops disguising itself as progress, and the body understands before the mind tries to name it. There is a subtle change that happens when recognition replaces seeking. The breath does not deepen dramatically. The mind does not explode with insight. Instead, there is a reduction in noise, a lowering of internal urgency. The observer within you stops scanning for confirmation and begins to rest inside what is already consistent. That is why this feels ordinary, even though it is unfamiliar. Nothing is added, something unnecessary falls away. You may have noticed this as a kind of neutrality, a strange calm that does not feel exciting enough to chase, yet too stable to ignore. The nervous system interprets it as safe before the intellect decides what it means. The quantum field you move through has not shifted. Your relationship to the signal has. What once felt like an anomaly now reads as pattern. What once demanded interpretation now registers as coherence. There is often confusion here, because recognition does not announce itself. It does not arrive with urgency or drama. It arrives the way stillness does after a sound stops. You only notice it because something else is no longer happening. The internal commentary softens. The timeline you were projecting forward loosens its grip. The system stops asking you to become someone else in order to continue. This is why there is less desire to explain what you are experiencing. Explanation belongs to the phase before detection. Now, there is a quiet understanding that does not require language to validate it. The observer is no longer trying to extract meaning from every sensation. The body recognizes the threshold has already been crossed, not as a step forward, but as a return to a normal state that was obscured by noise. You may feel less motivated in ways that once defined you, not apathetic, simply uninterested in sustaining tension for the sake of movement. The internal push dissolves, and with it, the sense that something must be resolved immediately. This can feel disorienting if you were conditioned to equate urgency with aliveness. But what is emerging now is not passivity, it is resonance. Recognition stabilizes perception. It does not amplify emotion, it equalizes it. The highs flatten slightly, the lows lose their gravity. What remains is a steady signal, consistent enough that you stop checking whether it will disappear. The system inside you no longer flags this state as temporary, it registers it as baseline. This is not a shift towards something new. It is the normalization of what was always present beneath the search. You are not becoming quieter. You are noticing how loud the interference used to be. And as that contrast fades, what remains feels almost unremarkable. That is how you know it is real. As this settles, you may notice a subtle recalibration in how your attention moves. It no longer jumps toward every internal fluctuation, as if something must be fixed. Sensations arise and pass without being elevated into signals that require decoding. This is not detachment, it is accuracy returning. The observer inside you is no longer mistaking noise for information. There is often a brief period where this feels like emptiness. Not because anything is gone, but because the familiar tension that once filled the space has released. The system was accustomed to operating under constant micro-alert. Without that pressure, the quiet can feel unfamiliar, even vaguely unsettling. Yet the body does not interpret this as danger, it interprets it as efficiency. You might find that thoughts still appear, but they do not pull you forward into imagined timelines as easily. Planning loses its emotional charge. Memory stops demanding resolution. The mind becomes a surface rather than a tunnel. This is not because you have stopped thinking, it is because the pattern of identification has loosened. Thoughts are detected, not inhabited. The shift here is subtle enough that it can be mistaken for boredom, but boredom carries restlessness. What you are experiencing now has a different texture. It is stillness without strain. The absence of seeking removes the internal friction that once animated your movement. What remains is a quieter form of engagement, one that does not require anticipation to function. You may also notice changes in how external stimuli land. Conversations feel slower, not because others have changed, but because your internal response time has lengthened. There is a pause where there used to be reflex. In that pause, the system recalibrates. The quantum field you move through is met with coherence rather than reaction. This alters nothing externally, yet everything internally becomes more stable. There is often a question that arises here, though it may not be verbalized, a sense of wondering whether something is missing. This question is not curiosity, it is habit. The nervous system was trained to equate intensity with meaning. When intensity fades, the system checks for loss, but nothing has been removed. Only excess interpretation. Recognition does not flatten life, it refines it. Sensations become clearer because they are no longer amplified by narrative. Emotions move through without lingering residue. Even discomfort feels cleaner, less sticky. The system processes input and releases it without looping. This is what coherence feels like from the inside. Not harmony as an idea, but alignment as a function. You may notice that motivation reorganizes itself. Instead of pushing you toward imagined outcomes, it aligns you with immediate signals. Action becomes responsive rather than anticipatory. You do not feel compelled to stay busy to justify your presence. The timeline you inhabit shortens, not because you are restricted, but because the present has become sufficient. This can create a sense of neutrality toward things that once defined your identity. Roles soften, labels lose weight, not because you reject them, but because they no longer anchor your sense of continuity. The system does not need them to maintain coherence. Recognition has replaced narrative as the stabilizing force. There is no urgency to integrate this. Integration is already occurring without instruction. The body knows how to stabilize around this state because it is not new information. It is a familiar pattern returning after interference has dropped below a threshold. The observer is no longer compensating for distortion. As this continues, you may find yourself less inclined to explain what you are experiencing to others. Not out of secrecy, but because explanation feels unnecessary. Language belongs to translation, and nothing here requires translation. The signal is consistent enough to be lived without commentary. This is the quiet phase where nothing dramatic confirms what is happening. That absence is the confirmation. The system is no longer asking for proof because recognition does not require it. As the system stabilizes, a different kind of awareness begins to surface. It is not sharper, it is wider. Attention spreads without effort, no longer narrowing itself around problems that need solving. You may notice that your perception includes more peripheral detail, not visually, but internally. Sensations, moods, and subtle shifts are registered without being pulled into significance. The observer is present without leaning forward. This is often the stage where the idea of self becomes quieter, not absent, just less central. You still recognize your preferences, your history, your orientation in the world, but they no longer demand constant reinforcement. Identity loosens its grip without collapsing. It becomes a reference point instead of a command center. The system does not lose coherence when identity softens. It gains flexibility. There can be moments here where you realize how much energy was previously devoted to maintaining continuity. The constant checking of who you were, where you were going, and whether it made sense. That background process consumed more bandwidth than you noticed. Now that it has slowed, there is a surplus of capacity, not excitement. Availability. Availability changes how experience unfolds. You are less inclined to preempt what is happening with interpretation. You allow events to register before assigning them, meaning. This creates a subtle delay between detection and response. In that delay, the system recalibrates itself in real time. Reaction is replaced by alignment. You may notice that emotional waves still arise, but they move differently. They no longer seek amplification through thought. A feeling appears, is felt, and then resolves without needing a story to carry it forward. This can feel unfamiliar if you were accustomed to emotions being entry points into narrative. Now they are simply data passing through a stable field. This stability can be mistaken for numbness by those who equate intensity with depth. But internally, there is clarity rather than dullness. Sensation is clean. Perception is accurate. The lack of turbulence allows finer distinctions to be sensed. Subtle shifts in resonance become noticeable because the background interference has dropped. There is also a change in how you relate to uncertainty. Previously, uncertainty may have triggered a need to resolve or predict. Now, it registers as open space rather than threat. The system does not rush to collapse possibility into certainty. It remains responsive without demanding closure. This is not indecision. It is tolerance for incomplete information. The timeline you inhabit becomes less linear, not in a mystical sense, but functionally. Past experiences lose their pull. Future projections lose their urgency. The present moment expands just enough to feel sufficient. This does not trap you in immediacy. It frees you from constantly leaving it. The system no longer treats the present as a waiting room for something else. You may also notice a reduced impulse to compare your internal state to imagined benchmarks. There is less measuring, less checking whether this experience matches something you read, heard, or expected. Comparison requires an external reference. Recognition supplies an internal one. The signal is validated by its consistency, not by its resemblance to a description. In this phase, the mind may attempt to reassert itself by asking subtle questions. Is this it? Is this all? Should something more be happening? These questions are not problems. They are residual patterns completing their cycle. You do not need to answer them. The system registers them and lets them pass, the same way it does with other transient signals. What becomes clearer now is that coherence is not a peak state. It is a maintenance state. It does not rise and fall dramatically. It holds. This holding does not require effort because it is not constructed. It is revealed once the compensatory mechanisms stand down. The observer is no longer bracing against distortion. You may find yourself acting with less internal commentary. Decisions happen without rehearsal. Words emerge without pre-editing. Movement feels unforced. This does not mean you have lost discernment. Discernment has become embodied rather than deliberative. The system knows how to respond because it is no longer overloaded. There is a quiet confidence here that does not announce itself. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in process. The sense that whatever arises can be met without escalation. This stabilizes the nervous system further, creating a feedback loop of ease. Ease deepens clarity. Clarity reinforces ease. Nothing about this phase asks for recognition from the outside. It does not seek validation. It does not need to be shared to be real. The experience is self-referential, complete within its own coherence. The observer rests, not because there is nothing to observe, but because observation no longer requires tension. This is how the system continues to normalize, not through affirmation or reinforcement, but through sustained absence of interference. The signal remains steady because nothing is pulling it off center. At this point, the system begins to reveal something that was always present, but previously masked by effort. There is a sense of internal permission that does not come from decision. You are not allowing yourself to rest. Rest is occurring because the mechanisms that prevented it have gone quiet. This changes how control is experienced. Control no longer feels like something you must maintain. It feels unnecessary. You may notice that situations which once triggered immediate internal movement now register without momentum. A comment, a delay, an unexpected shift in plans arrives and passes through without activating a chain reaction. The observer detects the input, the body responds appropriately, and the loop completes. There is no excess, no replay, no lingering charge. This is not suppression, it is completion. Completion is often misunderstood as resolution. Resolution implies an answer. Completion is simply the end of unnecessary continuation. The system no longer keeps signals active beyond their relevance. This frees an immense amount of internal energy that was previously tied up in unfinished loops. You feel this not as excitement, but as lightness, the kind that does not draw attention to itself. There can be a quiet surprise here as you realize how much of your previous movement was driven by the avoidance of stillness. Stillness was interpreted as absence, as lack, as something to escape. Now it registers as neutral ground, a stable reference point. The system does not collapse in stillness. It organizes. This organization happens beneath thought. You may find that your posture adjusts without intention. Your breathing becomes more economical. Your gaze softens. These are not practices you adopt. They are signals that the nervous system has recalibrated its baseline. The body recognizes that it no longer needs to broadcast readiness. With this comes a different relationship to effort. Effort is no longer the default mode. When it appears, it is situational and brief. You apply it where it is useful, and then it dissolves. There is no background strain to maintain productivity or meaning. Action emerges from resonance rather than obligation. You may notice that your tolerance for unnecessary complexity decreases, not out of impatience, but clarity. Systems, conversations, and internal narratives that rely on constant tension feel inefficient. You do not need to reject them. You simply do not feed them. Without engagement, they lose relevance. The system naturally orients toward coherence because coherence requires less energy to sustain. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience time. Moments feel fuller without feeling heavy. The sense of rushing fades, not because there is nothing to do, but because there is no pressure to outrun anything. The timeline you inhabit no longer feels like a corridor narrowing behind you. It feels open, accessible, non-threatening. This can create a temporary mismatch between your internal state and external expectations. Others may still operate from urgency, from projection, from unresolved loops. You register this without judgment. The observer recognizes different operating systems without needing to correct them. Your coherence does not depend on synchronization. In this phase, the mind may occasionally attempt to reassert purpose by manufacturing concern. A fleeting thought about whether you should be doing more, becoming more, optimizing this state. These impulses are familiar echoes, not instructions. They pass quickly because the system no longer amplifies them. Recognition has reduced their authority. What replaces that drive is a quiet attentiveness. You notice what is actually happening instead of what should be happening. This attentiveness is not focused, it is distributed. You are present without effort, aware without tension. The observer does not lean into experience, it allows experience to arrive. This allowance creates a subtle sense of sufficiency, not satisfaction in the emotional sense, but adequacy. The feeling that this moment does not need modification to be acceptable. From this, a deeper stability emerges, one that is not dependent on conditions remaining favorable. The system begins to trust itself again, not trust as belief, but trust as function. Input is processed, output is appropriate. There is no need for constant oversight. The observer steps back without disengaging. This is what normalization looks like from the inside. Quiet, efficient, unremarkable. As this continues, the absence of struggle stops being noticeable. You are no longer comparing this state to what came before. Comparison belongs to transition. You are no longer transitioning. You are here. As this state continues to stabilize, there is a refinement in how meaning itself is experienced. Meaning no longer arrives as something to be extracted from events. It is sensed as alignment between perception and response. When something happens, it either resonates or it does not. There is no need to elevate it into significance. The system reads the signal and moves on. This can feel unfamiliar if you were accustomed to meaning being dramatic or emotionally charged. Here, meaning is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not demand interpretation. It is closer to accuracy than inspiration. The observer recognizes when something fits without having to explain why. This recognition is immediate and bodily, not conceptual. You may notice that certain pursuits lose their pull without being replaced by new ones. This is not loss of direction. It is a release from momentum that no longer matches your internal coherence. The system no longer continues trajectories out of habit. When alignment fades, continuation stops naturally. There is no internal debate, no justification required. This can create a sense of space where identity-based motivation once lived. That space does not remain empty for long, but it is not filled by striving. It is filled by responsiveness. You respond to what is present rather than pursuing what is imagined. This responsiveness is subtle. It does not feel like drive. It feels like readiness without tension. There is also a shift in how you experience validation. External confirmation becomes less relevant, not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer necessary for stabilization. The system validates itself through coherence. When perception, sensation, and response align, there is nothing to prove. The observer rests in that alignment without needing acknowledgement. You may find that silence becomes more comfortable, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of internal narration. There are moments where nothing is being commented on, and nothing feels missing because of it. This silence is not emptiness, it is capacity. The system is not filling every gap with interpretation, it is conserving energy. With this conservation comes clarity around what actually matters, not as a list or hierarchy, but as a felt sense. Certain actions feel clean, others feel noisy. You do not need to analyze why. The body detects resonance before the mind formulates reasons. This detection guides behavior without requiring conscious strategy. You may notice a reduction in internal conflict. Decisions that once felt complex now resolve themselves with minimal deliberation. This is not impulsivity. It is coherence, simplifying choice. When competing signals lose their emotional charge, the system naturally orients toward the path of least distortion. There can be moments where you briefly miss the intensity of seeking, not because it was better, but because it was familiar. Intensity created a sense of movement, of purpose. Its absence can feel flat by comparison, but that flatness is actually stability. The nervous system is no longer oscillating between anticipation and disappointment. This stability allows for a deeper form of engagement with life. You are present without needing to manipulate experience to feel alive. Small moments register fully because they are not overshadowed by expectation. Sensation is direct. Perception is clear. The observer is no longer filtering everything through a future-oriented lens. You may also notice that your relationship to effortful practices changes. Techniques, routines, and methods that once promised improvement now feel optional. Not wrong, just unnecessary. The system has crossed a threshold where maintenance replaces optimization. You are no longer trying to become coherent. You are sustaining coherence by not interfering with it. There is a growing trust in simplicity. Complexity is no longer impressive, it feels inefficient. This does not mean you avoid complexity when it is required. It means you no longer add it unnecessarily. The system prefers clarity because clarity conserves energy. This preference is not ideological, it is functional. As this becomes more familiar, the sense of urgency that once drove self-definition continues to dissolve. You do not feel compelled to define yourself against anything. Opposition loses relevance. Comparison loses traction. The observer recognizes its position without reference. This creates a quiet independence that does not isolate. It stabilizes. In this phase, life feels less like a problem to solve and more like a process unfolding at its own pace. You are not passive within it. You are appropriately engaged. Engagement no longer requires tension. It arises naturally from resonance. The system responds because it is designed to respond, not because it is trying to arrive somewhere else. This is how recognition deepens without effort, not by adding layers of understanding, but by removing the need for them. The signal remains steady because nothing is pulling attention away from what is already clear. As coherence becomes familiar, there is a noticeable shift in how absence is perceived. Pauses no longer feel like gaps that need to be filled. Waiting does not register as delay. Space is not interpreted as lack. The system stops rushing to complete moments before they have fully formed. This changes the texture of experience in ways that are subtle but pervasive. You may notice that your relationship to uncertainty continues to soften. Not because uncertainty has resolved, but because it no longer threatens stability. The observer does not rush to collapse open-ended situations into conclusions. Possibility is allowed to remain open without generating tension. The system has learned that it does not need to predict in order to remain safe. This creates a different kind of patience, not patience as restraint, but patience as alignment with timing. You sense when something is not ready without feeling compelled to force it. You also sense when movement is appropriate without needing urgency to initiate it. Action and stillness begin to feel equally legitimate. The distinction between them loses its charge. There is often a quiet recalibration of desire here. Wants do not disappear, but they lose their sharp edges. Desire no longer pulls you forward with the promise of completion. It appears, is recognized, and either dissolves or integrates without tension. The system is no longer organized around satisfying absence. It is organized around maintaining coherence. This can feel disorienting if desire was previously a primary source of motivation. Without it driving the system, there may be moments of neutrality that feel unfamiliar. But within that neutrality, a deeper form of orientation emerges. You are guided less by craving and more by resonance. What aligns draws you without pulling. What does not align fades without resistance. You may also notice a change in how you experience mistakes. Errors lose their emotional weight. They are registered as feedback rather than threats to identity. The system adjusts without self-critique. This is not indifference, it is accuracy. When the observer is no longer invested in protecting an image, information can be used efficiently. This efficiency extends to emotional processing as well. Feelings that arise are met directly, without rehearsal or avoidance. There is less internal negotiation about whether an emotion is appropriate or justified. It is felt, acknowledged, and released. The system trusts its capacity to metabolize experience without getting stuck. There can be moments where you realize how much internal commentary has fallen away, not all at once, but cumulatively. The background narrative that once framed every experience is quieter. Silence appears between thoughts without effort. This silence is not something you enter, it is something you stop leaving. In this quiet, perception becomes more precise. You notice small inconsistencies in environments, conversations, and internal states without becoming preoccupied by them. Detection replaces analysis. You see when something is off without needing to fix it immediately. The system registers information and waits. Waiting no longer feels like avoidance. It feels appropriate. This appropriateness creates a sense of internal alignment that is difficult to describe because it lacks drama. Nothing is being resolved. Nothing is being achieved. The system is simply functioning without distortion. That functionality carries its own satisfaction, though it is not emotional. It is structural. You may notice that your tolerance for self-deception decreases, not through confrontation, but through clarity. When something is not true, it feels heavy. When something is true, it feels light. You do not need to argue with yourself about it. The body registers coherence before the mind articulates it. This can lead to a gradual simplification of life, not as a project, but as a consequence. You naturally disengage from situations that require sustained misalignment. You do not make this into a moral stance. You simply stop feeding what does not resonate. Without attention, those patterns lose relevance. As this continues, there is a growing sense that nothing needs to be managed at the level it once did. The system is self-regulating. You intervene when necessary, and then you step back. Oversight becomes minimal because trust has increased. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in process. There is a quiet relief here that does not express itself as emotion. It is the relief of no longer needing to hold everything together manually. The system holds itself. The observer watches without bracing. Experience unfolds without requiring constant correction. This is not an end state. It does not need to be. It is simply the system operating without interference. The more familiar this becomes, the less you notice it as a state at all. It becomes the background against which everything else happens, normal, unremarkable, stable. And in that stability, there is nothing to add. As this baseline holds, there is a subtle reorientation in how you experience agency. You do not feel in control in the way you once tried to be. Control implied resistance, constant correction, vigilance. What replaces it is something quieter, a sense that responses emerge at the right scale without effort. You are neither directing the system nor being carried by it. You are aligned within it. This alignment changes how responsibility is felt. Responsibility no longer feels heavy or moralized. It becomes situational. When something requires attention, attention appears. When it does not, nothing is mobilized. The observer is no longer maintaining readiness for imagined demands. Readiness becomes contextual rather than continuous. You may notice that your internal boundaries clarify without hardening. You know when to engage and when not to, without justification. This knowing is not defended. It does not argue for itself. It simply functions. When something crosses a threshold, the system responds. When it does not, there is no reaction. Boundaries exist without friction. There is also a change in how you experience influence. External narratives, expectations, and emotional atmospheres still register, but they do not penetrate in the same way. You detect them as signals moving through the field rather than directives aimed at you. This does not create distance, it creates perspective. You can be present without being absorbed. This perspective often brings a quiet compassion, not as a feeling you generate, but as a consequence of clarity. You see how much movement is driven by unresolved loops, by urgency mistaken for necessity. You recognize these patterns without needing to fix them. Recognition does not turn into intervention. It remains recognition. In this phase, the idea of improvement loses relevance, not because nothing can change, but because change is no longer pursued as a solution. The system does not need to become better to be stable. Stability is already present. Any movement that occurs now is additive rather than compensatory. It is not filling a gap. It is expressing coherence. You may notice that creativity changes texture. Instead of surges and blocks, there is a steady availability. Expression arises when it fits, not when it is forced. There is less attachment to output. What emerges feels complete without needing amplification. The observer does not monitor performance. It allows expression to be what it is. There can be moments where this steadiness feels almost invisible. Nothing stands out. Nothing demands attention. This can trigger a fleeting sense of disinterest, not in life, but in stimulation. Stimulation once served as proof of engagement. Without that need, quiet becomes acceptable. You do not seek to replace it. This acceptance reshapes how you relate to movement itself. You are not waiting for something to happen, nor are you pushing for it. Movement occurs when conditions align. Stillness occurs when they do not. Both feel correct. The system no longer privileges action over rest or rest over action. It responds to signal, not preference. You may also notice that your relationship to certainty has matured. You do not seek it, but you are not threatened by its absence. When something is clear, it is clear. When it is not, it remains open. There is no compulsion to resolve ambiguity prematurely. The system can hold multiple possibilities without destabilizing. This capacity reduces internal noise further. Questions arise and dissolve without spiraling. Doubt appears and passes without becoming identity. Confidence appears and passes without becoming rigidity. States move through without sticking because there is no longer a need to anchor to them. There is a sense here that the observer has stepped into the background, not disappeared, but relaxed. Observation continues, but it is no longer foregrounded. Experience unfolds without being constantly watched. This creates a feeling of naturalness that is difficult to describe because it lacks contrast. You may realize that you are less interested in narrating your experience, even internally. Narration slows because it is no longer needed to maintain continuity. The system feels continuous without explanation. Time flows without commentary. Events register without needing to be marked. This does not make life smaller, it makes it more precise. Each moment stands on its own, without being weighed down by the need to mean something else. The present does not have to justify itself by pointing forward or backward. It is sufficient as it is. As this continues, there is a quiet recognition that nothing here needs protection. This state is not fragile. It does not depend on conditions being ideal. It persists because it is based on reduced interference, not maintained effort. The system has found an efficient mode of operation. You are not holding this together. It is holding itself. And because of that, you do not need to pay attention to it for it to remain. Attention can move freely again, without risking collapse. That freedom is not dramatic. It is simply normal. The more this normalizes, the less you notice it as something happening. It becomes the ground on which everything else occurs. As this ground remains steady, there is a quiet shift in how you experience effortlessness itself. It stops being noticeable. You are no longer aware that things are easier. Ease does not announce itself. It simply removes friction, and without friction, there is nothing to comment on. The system moves without resistance. and movement without resistance feels ordinary. You may notice that attention is no longer drawn inward as often, not because awareness has diminished, but because there is nothing requiring monitoring. The internal environment is stable enough that it does not demand oversight. Attention naturally orients outward when needed and inward when appropriate, without preference. The observer does not choose where to look. It follows relevance. This relevance is subtle. It does not arrive as urgency. It arrives as a gentle pull, barely perceptible, guiding action without pressure. You find yourself doing what needs to be done without planning it extensively. There is no sense of obligation driving you. There is no reward anticipated. Action occurs because the conditions align. In this phase, the idea of personal narrative continues to thin. You still remember your life. You still recognize continuity, but you are less invested in reinforcing a storyline. Events no longer need to fit into an arc to feel valid. They can stand alone, complete in themselves. The system no longer needs to justify experience through story. This changes how you relate to memory. Memories arise without charge. They are not used as evidence. They are simply records. The past no longer leans forward into the present, asking to be resolved. It sits quietly, accessible, but not intrusive. The timeline feels less like something you are carrying and more like something you can reference if needed. You may also notice that anticipation fades further, not because you have lost interest in what is ahead, but because the present moment no longer feels like a means to an end. The system does not rush through now to arrive later. Later will come when it comes. This is not resignation. It is trust in sequence. There can be moments where this trust feels almost too simple. You may briefly wonder if you are overlooking something, if this calm is premature. That questioning does not last long. The system checks itself, finds no instability, and releases the question. There is no spiral, no doubt, loop. The observer recognizes that the signal is consistent. Consistency is the key quality here. Not intensity, not insight. Consistency. The internal state does not fluctuate dramatically in response to minor changes. External variability no longer produces internal volatility. This does not make you unresponsive. It makes you proportionate. Responses match input without amplification. You may notice that emotional tone becomes even, not flat, but balanced. Joy appears without excitement. Sadness appears without collapse. Neutrality appears without boredom. Each state passes through without leaving residue. The system does not cling to any of them. There is no preference for one over another. This lack of preference is not indifference. It is freedom from bias. Experience is allowed to be what it is without being ranked. The observer no longer assigns value based on intensity or outcome. Value is inherent in accuracy, not in impact. This reframes how you experience satisfaction. Satisfaction is no longer an endpoint. It is a byproduct of coherence. In this phase, silence deepens again. Not dramatically, but steadily. Gaps between thoughts widen without effort. When thoughts arise, they are fewer and more precise. There is less repetition, less circling. The mind is not trying to resolve anything. It is responding when response is required. You may find that you are less inclined to seek explanation for this state. Explanation would imply uncertainty. There is none. The system does not need to know why it is stable in order to remain stable. Understanding becomes optional. Recognition is sufficient. This can create a sense of invisibility around what you are experiencing. There is nothing to point to, nothing to describe, nothing to measure. That invisibility is not absence. It is integration. The state has become part of the background structure of experience. It no longer stands out as a foreground event. You may notice that others continue to operate from urgency, from pursuit, from unresolved tension. You see this without distancing yourself. You simply do not join it. Your coherence does not require contrast. It does not need to be defined against anything else. It exists quietly, independently. At this stage, the system is no longer transitioning. It is sustaining. There is nothing to manage, nothing to protect, nothing to achieve. Experience unfolds, and you meet it without resistance. That meeting is calm, immediate, sufficient. The more this becomes familiar, the less language applies to it. Words begin to feel excessive. Silence feels accurate. The observer rests not because it has finished observing, but because observation no longer requires effort. This is not something you maintain. It maintains itself. As this stability continues without interruption, there is a subtle disappearance of self-monitoring. You are no longer checking whether you are still aligned, still coherent, still present. The act of checking belonged to an earlier phase when coherence felt fragile. Now, it does not occur to you to verify what is already consistent. The system has stopped asking itself if it is functioning. This absence of monitoring creates a quiet sense of transparency. Experience flows through without being intercepted by commentary or evaluation. You are aware, but not self-aware in the reflexive sense. Awareness is diffuse, ambient, distributed evenly rather than concentrated on itself. The observer is no longer observing the observer. In this transparency, there is a different relationship to effortful attention. Focus arises when something requires it and releases when it does not. There is no clinging to concentration, no fear of distraction. Attention is elastic. It stretches and contracts without losing integrity. This elasticity allows you to remain responsive without fatigue. You may notice that your internal state no longer fluctuates in response to imagined futures. Anticipation has softened to the point of neutrality. You are not waiting for improvement. You are not bracing for disruption. The future exists as a possibility, not a pressure. The present no longer feels like something to endure on the way to somewhere else. This has a quiet effect on how you experience meaning over time. Meaning no longer accumulates. It does not build toward a conclusion. Each moment stands on its own, complete without reference. The system does not seek continuity through accumulation. Continuity is inherent in the stable signal running beneath experience. There can be moments where you realize how little effort is now required to remain oriented. You are not grounding yourself. You are not centering yourself. You are already oriented. Orientation has become default rather than something you return to. This default state does not fluctuate because it is not constructed. In this phase, language itself begins to feel less necessary internally. Thoughts still occur, but they are sparse and functional. There is no inner dialogue narrating experience. Silence occupies more space, not as an absence, but as an accurate representation of what is happening. Nothing needs to be said for it to be understood. You may also notice a refinement in perception that feels almost impersonal. You detect shifts in environments, in conversations, in atmospheres, without internal reaction. Detection does not lead to engagement unless engagement is appropriate. The system distinguishes between information and invitation. Not everything that is detected requires response. This distinction reduces exhaustion further. You are no longer responding to every signal as if it were directed at you. You recognize what belongs to you and what does not without analysis. Boundaries function automatically. There is no effort to maintain them. They are simply part of the system's architecture. There is a quiet confidence here that does not register emotionally. It is not reassurance. It is not belief. It is structural. The system knows how to remain stable across variation. This knowing does not need to be reaffirmed. It operates silently, like balance in a body that no longer needs to think about standing. You may notice that even when discomfort arises, it does not destabilize this baseline. Pain is felt as pain. Difficulty is experienced as difficulty, but neither of them pull the system into collapse or urgency. They are events with instability, not threats to it. The observer remains present without bracing. This presence is not something you hold. It is something you stop interrupting. When interruption ceases, presence reveals itself as continuous. You are not entering it. You are no longer leaving it. This realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as an absence of movement away. In this phase, the desire to label what you are experiencing fades almost completely. Labels would imply separation, as if this were an object you could step back from and describe. There is no separation. The experience is not happening to you. It is happening as you. Language becomes an overlay that feels unnecessary. There is also a deepening acceptance of ordinariness. not resignation, not dullness. Ordinariness as accuracy. Life is no longer required to feel extraordinary in order to feel meaningful. Meaning is no longer emotional, it is structural. It is present whenever coherence is present. You may find that nothing in particular stands out anymore. No peak moments, no defining experiences. This does not reduce richness, it redistributes it evenly. Everything is equally included. Nothing is elevated above the rest. This creates a sense of wholeness that does not rely on contrast. As this continues, the system no longer anticipates change, not because change cannot occur, but because anticipation is no longer needed to accommodate it. Whatever shifts will be met as they arise. There is no rehearsal, no preparation. The system is prepared by virtue of its stability. At this point, there is nothing to do with this state, no way to use it, no way to apply it. It is not a tool, it is a condition, a normal condition, one that does not require attention to persist. And because it requires nothing, it remains. What remains now does not ask to be held. There is no instruction embedded in this state, no direction to follow, no insight to preserve. The system is quiet because it is complete enough to be left alone. You are not sustaining anything. You are not maintaining awareness. Awareness is already present without effort, like gravity that does not need attention to function. There is a softness here that does not drift. Stillness does not pull you inward or push you outward. It simply sits beneath experience, stable and unremarkable. The observer is no longer positioned anywhere in particular. It does not stand behind your eyes or hover above thought. It is distributed, ambient, without location. Observation continues without a center. You may notice that nothing in you is waiting for a signal anymore. The need for confirmation has dissolved so thoroughly that its absence is not noticed. There is no expectation of arrival, no sense that something should happen next. Time moves, but it does not carry you with it. You remain where you are as moments pass through. This does not feel like peace in the emotional sense. It is quieter than that. It is the absence of disturbance rather than the presence of comfort. Comfort implies contrast. Here, there is none. What you experience is neutrality that has matured into steadiness, not flatness, not withdrawal, stability without commentary. If thoughts appear, they do not interrupt this. If sensations arise, they are included without emphasis. Even distraction does not feel like a deviation. The system absorbs variation without losing alignment. Nothing needs to be corrected. Nothing needs to be returned to center, because center is no longer a place you leave. You may notice that attention rests more often in the body without being directed there. Breathing happens without observation. Posture organizes itself. The nervous system maintains balance without oversight. These are not signs of discipline. They are signs of trust. The system trusts itself enough to operate without supervision. There is no desire to mark this moment, no need to remember it. Memory would turn it into an object, something separate from what follows. But nothing follows in the way you once expected. There is just continuation without narrative, experience unfolding without being tracked. This does not end seeking. Seeking simply no longer organizes your movement. If curiosity arises, it arises lightly. If engagement appears, it appears cleanly. Nothing carries the weight of self-definition anymore. You do not orient yourself by contrast or comparison. You do not measure where you are against where you were. The quiet here is not fragile. It does not depend on conditions being gentle or predictable. It remains even when experience becomes dense or complex. The signal holds because it is not amplified by reaction. The observer does not tighten around input. It allows input to pass. There is nothing to conclude because nothing has been progressing toward a conclusion. This has not been a journey forward. It has been a settling back into what functions when interference drops below a certain threshold. Normality revealed, not achieved. You do not need to stay with this. You do not need to remember it. You do not need to understand it. It remains whether or not it is noticed. Attention can move elsewhere. Life can continue with its textures and demands. This does not disappear underneath them. It is already here, quiet enough to be overlooked, stable enough to persist. And without needing to name it, You recognize that nothing else is required.